Moving into sort of the most actionable items that were taken from all of this. Obviously, the initial document is massive and in a lot of detail, which I think is important when we're developing a theory. I default to an old saying, it may only be in the US, but if you can't explain something to a 5-year-old, you don't understand it. So I tend to think that distillation and refinement is really important. I think that the team has done a great job this morning of trying to do that. So I'm going to just open it up to generally the team. I can present and we can kind of go side by side on what they have taken from this. How do we define IR? We all had some input here, but Wafa, I think you pretty much took ownership in trying to summarize this. You have the floor.
Yes, so initially before we started, we had a preliminary, what we thought was the definition of IR. And then as we went through it, we kind of just condensed the same information down. So the working definition for now is insulin resistance is the reduced sensitivity of cells to insulin. As cells stop responding, they become more insulin resistant. If this becomes widespread in different tissues, then the body is considered insulin resistant. Insulin resistance is accompanied by hyperinsulinemia, and when prolonged can result in impaired glucose tolerance and hyperglycemia. So that's sort of what we've got for now, including both the cells individually and then larger tissue, the whole body, and then finally also putting in that factor of hyperinsulinemia. That's it.
Yeah, I like it very much because I think this responds to a lot of questions that we had. If we answer it this way, yeah, I like it.
Okay, who's up?
Lab test.
Yeah, so we have the gold standard, which is the hyperinsulinic euglycemic clamp. We collected the values that we would use for identifying insulin resistance. The next best, I guess, in general, is fasting insulin, although debatable, and also the value being debatable, but it's like the most available and the most direct one. We can say fasting glucose is another marker of the fasting state. We will start seeing an elevation in fasting glucose in the early stage and all the way up to diabetes. HOME-IR is a mix of both. It's an index that is composed of fasting insulin and fasting glucose. It's bracketed there that it represents mostly resistance. So glucose tolerance is included in that, in the peripheral tissues mostly. While another index that can be used, although a bit more complex and less common, is the Matsuda index, which works the other way around. It measures sensitivity, includes the liver also, so can be useful in some cases. Postprandial measurement, obviously the OGTT, the oral glucose tolerance test, and that's where we can spot the line between insulin resistance and possibly what happens in prediabetes and diabetes. Although postprandial glucose behavior is more complex than just that. Fasting triglyceride is the non-glucose area in which we can spot insulin resistance. It's like it correlates strongly to HOME-IR, and there is even an index which measures fasting triglyceride in relation to fasting insulin and so on. So it's a very useful tool, also pretty easy to acquire. So definitely in our top list of symptoms and lab results.
Awesome.
Just quick comment. I think it's a good step, and maybe in the future, not in this sprint, and it's not something I would say it's an objection or anything. It's just something to improve. That fasting insulin for lean people seem to be, for lean insulin resistant people seem to be lower. I sent you a paper about that. And that's also our experience in the family. Quite many people, but anyway, that's a long story. Yeah, I like fasting triglycerides. Many people mention HDL with triglycerides. I'm not an expert, but it would be interesting to hear your opinion, not now, about that.
If all this research has taught me one thing anyway, it's that every one of these measures is very context dependent.
And I have one question. Is this an or an and? So should we say or something else? So when do we consider someone insulin resistance? When one of these is true, or when several of these are true, or when all of them are true? So that's something that we should decide. Maybe not now, but soon later.
Well, I would say the possibility of people doing a euglycemic clamp is relatively low. So I wouldn't say that that should be a necessary criteria for everyone. But
Yeah.
sure. Okay, thank you, Colin.
So yeah, this is me. So when looking at the frequency of insulin resistance in the US, this kind of caused a little bit of some thinking. And we kind of created this sort of formula where insulin resistance is the number of people who have IR or metabolic disease but no confirmed hyperglycemia, plus people who are pre-diabetic and cases of diabetes. That kind of helped us sort of know what direction we're heading at. People with IR or metabolic disease but no hypoglycemia, that value is unknown. It's often not measured for, or the bloods don't correlate perfectly, but we do know the prevalences of the other two diseases. So when trying to calculate this frequency of the prevalence, initially what I tried to do was find the unknown, and I thought looking at other insulin resistant specific diseases like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, PCOS, and Alzheimer's, and sort of gathering the prevalence of those diseases and adding it on top, and that gave us around 94%. But that's imperfect with lots of different issues, but it does raise the insulin resistance much higher in the population. And then when looking at some of the papers that Cheesy had sent, looking at metabolically unwell people in the US, those figures were between 88 to 93%. And so really, regardless of which way we kind of choose, the figure is likely to be in the late 80s, early 90s. And that unknown number accounts for a much higher prevalence in the population. And I think that should be somewhere around what our target is, at least when we think of frequency of IR. It's about 93 to 94% in the population. And that's it. That's kind of my thought process behind it.
Yeah, I have very little to volunteer in ways that we could improve that number. So.
Yeah, I think as you mentioned in the doc that there may be an overlap in the different diseases with each other. Actually, there is a huge overlap, especially type 2 diabetes. So it's difficult to just add them up, but the number may be good, but.
I would safely say it's an overestimate, 100%. But in general, I think it captures a higher prevalence than we would find by ignoring potential overlap. And I'm not sure how we can reconcile that.
I think the number is good, but maybe there are more diseases that we should consider, and they overlap.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Which is why I think we could use the second figure as those who are metabolically unwell and have that kind of as a range. Either way, we know it's in the 90s, our potential estimate.
We can do 93 with an asterisk next to it.
Question mark.
Awesome. Thank you. Any other comments, questions, Jennifer?
Oh yeah, I was just going to say that this 93 probably corresponds to just adults, right? Or is this including children? Oh, you're muted.
If I'm not mistaken, adults, but I'll double check.
It's actually a very, very good question. We should always know.
Yeah. Sorry.
Because even kids are metabolically sick often. Maybe the majority of them, but probably not 93%.
Yeah, and PCOS, formal diagnosis may be later, but the development of PCOS can certainly start to manifest in early teen girls. So sure. Okay. This is a combination of 3 questions, largely because they overlap. But Kaled, this is your hornet's nest.
Yeah. So what are the mechanisms and where does it begin? Is it local or does it happen in different parts of the body? They all connect because, as we can see, there is a lot of crosstalk and connection between what happens in the to the right, our main character, the adipose tissue, the yellow bubble, the left, the skeletal muscle, and up there, the liver. So the standing and strongest theory that we all agreed to support is that insulin resistance as a pathology, as like resistance of the insulin receptor happens and is like the result of the adipose tissue being overloaded with metabolites, mainly fatty acids, that it is the place for their storage. And when that overload happens, the adipose tissue is the first to become really insulin resistant, which then, as we can see down in the arrow, means that it starts sending fatty acids around the body. The fatty acids could and usually collect both in the liver and in the muscle. They are most detrimental when they collect in the muscle because they transform, as we see down there, to ceramides and other secondary metabolites that basically stuff the muscle and overload the muscle in a similar way to what happened in the adipose tissue before, thus causing insulin resistance there, less functionality in the receptor. The liver is always part of the picture. There is also the liver-pancreas axis, which is something that we left aside going on, but basically the liver also can become full of fatty acids and actually have a reverse function than storage, but actually produce glucose, so become totally insulin resistant. Basically, instead of storing glycogen, just sending out fatty acids also and glucose. So yeah, where does it begin? There is the before insulin resistance stage, which is debatable. Is it hyperinsulinemia that is caused by pancreas toxicity or something else? But what we call insulin resistance, as in the body, is something that starts in the adipose tissue, affecting the other tissues. And it goes on in a negative cycle with this kind of pattern. But the center of it is the fatty acids overloading the different tissues.
This may be true. I'm really not sure. My feeling is that there are many cell types, not just these 3 organs, but so many cell types, and this may also explain maybe the majority of the cases, maybe all. I'm not sure, but I do know about cases when you don't see any problems in the muscles, in the liver, what else, in the fat cells. So people who look totally healthy and they don't have any blood. I mean, most of their blood values are fine, like the triglycerides and the HDL, and that, and still they have insulin resistance symptoms. So maybe this explains the majority, but not everything. So I really like the definition of insulin resistance, which allows other, I mean, doesn't restrict the insulin resistance to any organ.
Wafa?
Yes, Cheesy. So just to add to that, because I touched upon this as well, and Khalid looked into it a little bit deeper, there are other cells in the body that are also impacted, like the endothelial cells, lining the arteries. And so as the body becomes more and more insulin resistant, they might be able to pick up on this a bit further. And so you've got certain things like reduction in nitric oxide, which causes increase in the size of the vessels themselves, and so you're getting more constriction, and then you can get hypertension. And I think Khaled looked into this as well, touched upon it. So there are other cells that are also being affected that are causing other symptoms like hypertension, like the beginnings of PCOS. So even though this mechanism is the major mechanism, other cells are still being affected in different ways, causing different symptoms. I think, Khaled, you know that.
Yeah, we did cover other mechanisms, and some theories also claim different beginnings of insulin resistance. Some say that it can start in the muscle actually. So the same circle starting in the muscle, some that it starts in the liver, non-alcoholic fatty liver, so, and the pancreas, of course. But we decided, and it was in a discussion with the team, that when can we say that the body is becoming organically insulin resistant is when we notice that the adipose tissue is getting to the threshold. So we kind of set a bar of, okay, who is an insulin resistant person? Is like, so we decided to have this as like the general, like the most organic view of what is an insulin resistant persona, but we covered other mechanisms, especially some with glucagon and hyperinsulinemia happening out of this cycle.
For the sake of, we don't have a lot of time, so if I could just put the finest point that I can muster on this. This affects every tissue in the body, but these three cell types here are related to the energy component. So insulin resistance itself is an excess in energy and ultimately a failure to store and account for all of that energy. Necessarily as a first step, the reason why we have an energy storage problem is at the level of the adipocyte. So that intrinsically makes sense that that's the first domino that has to fall in order for it to become an energy imbalance system across the whole body. Muscle cell obviously needs to be implicated because it's the largest uptake source of glucose in the body. So lean body mass dysfunction in general, or insulin resistance in the muscles, it's highly debated on how permanent or serious that is relative to other body systems. Some people claim that you can get rid of muscle insulin resistance relatively quickly with an exercise, but as soon as you ingest glucose, you're right back in it. And of course, with the liver, we're talking about the increase in triglycerides, essentially, and free glucose as a result of hepatic dysfunction in general. So even though it does affect neurons and Alzheimer's and cardiac tissue and all these other tissues in the body, these three are the primary movers of energy imbalance in the system. So if we are defining insulin resistance in general as, hyperglycemia, as that moves into type 2 diabetes, these are the major players that are going to be contributing or failing to contribute in the energy balance of glucose in the body.
So my original intention with this question was that I had a hypothesis that it may be different from person to person, and in some cases not these are the main tissue starts happening. But anyway, let's not finish let's not solve it now because there's no time.
Sure. Why some people will have dysfunction in their heart before they have dysfunction in their head with early onset dementia? It's like, at that level, I don't think anyone here claims to maybe Kaled with his insistent finger, but yeah, go ahead.
No, I think there is like, because there is another question about hyperinsulinemia. And although hyperinsulinemia is almost the same thing as insulin resistant, but they are not. So hyperinsulinemia could precede all this scenario. And in that, there would be included the early stage of insulin resistance.
Yeah. So hyperinsulinemia, and it can cause insulin resistance in very, very different cells than these ones also.
Yeah. So that, but then, as I said, we tried with the team to say when is actually insulin resistance happening, like So this is like the point when this axis starts to play that.
Yeah. My concern was that many people don't have this problem, but still have a lot of problems related to insulin resistance, and we want to treat them. And my concern is if we constrain insulin resistance to this, then they may not be treated.
I think hyperinsulinemia apart, or the slide there will help us like detach the both aspects, that before this axis starts and after, kind of.
It's also worth mentioning that this likely isn't a door that once it's closed forever. People probably teeter on the edge of insulin resistance for a while before it becomes full-blown problem. So I'm sure that there's a whole swath of people that are flickering into insulin resistance periodically with adipocyte stress and everything that may start to show beginning signs intermittently, and then it will resolve in between lab testing, which are done infrequently. So anyway, we can continue the debate.
Oh, that's me. So yeah, it's we'll try to cut it short. So insulin resistance is the state that we explain in which some tissues are, as we said, resistant to the insulin signal, so they can't intake energy, glucose, in the form of glucose, and it's usually accompanied by hyperinsulinemia, so high levels of insulin trying to adjust it. Different cases, different patients have an adaptation, so they could have more insulin production, larger pancreas, maybe physical activity or some other aspects that help them tolerate the glucose. So they could still take in glucose in the tissues. When does it change is the stage that we call prediabetes, and diabetes is when either insulin output or the insulin sensitivity is not enough to deal with that extra glucose anymore. So we start seeing what we call glucose intolerance, that the extra glucose stays in the blood, leading to glucotoxicity, and usually from there on, it just goes and worse and worse. So the insulin, as we said, insulin output and insulin sensitivity just becomes lower and lower, till type 2 diabetes, when insulin is just too low to actually deal even with fasting glucose, let's say.
Yeah, so insulin resistance is your body is still able to maintain generally normal glucose levels in spite of the fact that it's losing sensitivity to insulin. So it's largely manifest by just hyperinsulinemia. It's becoming less effective, but generally you're not seeing hyper or glucose toxicity as a result. It becomes diabetes when your level of endogenous insulin production becomes insufficient to maintain a euglycemic range. And then you start to see elevated insulin and elevated glucose as a result. So it's the top of the roller coaster where insulin just cannot continue to increase. It starts to lose efficacy, and then we see a corresponding rise in glucose. Any resistance to that? Okay. Wafa.
Okay, so tackling diet, it was a big topic, and trying to kind of give the key takeaways. I've sort of summarized things down, but briefly, so when we look at diet, whether calories or the quality of the food matters, both of them matter for different reasons. Ideally, we want to stay away from highly processed foods. So the quality of the food is really important, but also the quantity is important. Even though someone can be on higher calories, if you're on a keto diet with higher calories, for example, that's still not necessarily a negative thing. So that's going to be important for calorie counting. If we are trying to lose weight and reduce insulin resistance, you can do that. Studies have shown that you can do that both from a low carb diet, but also from a low fat diet. However, being on a ketotic diet has some benefits because there's less hunger, more feelings of satiety in general. So there are different benefits to the different diets. Macronutrients play a role in satiety, but other non-nutrients and metabolic active foods do also play a role. I found some interesting studies on certain teas, for example, green tea or coffee can actually induce satiety through intervention studies. So that might be something we can maybe consider a bit more. I didn't delve too deep into it, but there is room for that. I've also looked at the different macronutrients and found that there is evidence that if you are on a low protein diet, you tend to overeat, and you overeat food that might be nutritionally dense or high in nutritionally poor but calorie dense, such as carbohydrates and fats, and that might be contributing to this entire picture of overeating, obesity, reduced satiety, and then eventually like insulin resistance. Part of the reason is because of the protein leverage theory, that hypothesis that our body is driven to consume lots and lots of protein until we meet our daily needs, and that is sort of the philosophy behind what's kind of going on in the eating habits that we have. It's part of the issue. It's not the only issue. The other part is that a lot of highly processed food is highly palatable with increased sugar and fats, and that kind of the combination of carbohydrates and fats is quite unique, and it's kind of inducing a lot of the insulin resistance that we have going on. The other key points about diet, for example, there isn't really any conclusive evidence that different types of fats contribute to insulin resistance, but specific things like omega-6 in vegetable oils is shown to be more detrimental. So your PUFAs, specifically omega-6, can have that sort of stimulate inflammation in the body, and so there are specific ones that we kind of need to look out for. So avoiding, for example, seed oils is much more important than avoiding other fats. And then other things like, for example, sweeteners, I also thought was really interesting. There are studies that are showing that they might stimulate insulin resistance by increasing kind of our cravings for sweets, but also contributing to gut dysbiosis. And I think we can touch upon that a bit more when we kind of go through gut dysbiosis. So that's sort of generally what I've kind of come up with. These are just takeaways. There's a lot more detail in document, but a lot of it is in line with what our hypotheses were in relation to what the best foods are. And it goes a lot in line with reducing carbs, going for more nutritious food, and then kind of removing anything that's artificially made. So yeah, that's it.
I like most of it. That I have very small problems or concerns with this statement about omega-6 to omega-3. I think it's more complex, and the problems with omega-6 is partly the easy oxidation, but it's also a problem with omega-3. So if we had that level, that high quantities of omega-3 in taken in as oil, then we would have problems. Also, omega-6 comes with plant sterols, and that's a separate issue. It's not the omega-6; it comes from the being a plant oil. So that's why this is a complex thing, and probably not the omega-6. Omega-3 is the key.
Well, part of the key is that this omega-6 to omega-3 ratio should not be addressed with supplementation. It's largely dictated by the foods that these are high in and regulating their consumption accordingly. So a high omega-3 supplement may be prone to oxidation, which may have other downstream effects, but that is not implied by just eating more salmon. And likewise, reducing your omega-6 content could have anti-inflammatory properties by its own dent, but it's also the benefit of removing foods that are mostly high in them, which would be highly refined, processed foods that involve vegetable oils. So if we zoom out from a supplemental or these things in isolation, the overall food categories that they fit into, I think, are universally more easily accepted.
Mm-hmm.
It is complex, but if we just talk a food first protocol, I think this becomes easier to get behind.
Yeah, So I think this statement is probably just a snapshot, but Cheese, you're absolutely right. It is really complex, that kind of relationship, but the more important thing out of that is this kind of avoidance of like these refined oils, like your soybean oils or your canola oils, I think that's what it's called. And those are found like that we're eating that thousands more times in our diet now than what our ancestors would have eaten before. And that's sort of contributing to this issue. So that's the bigger problem rather than just the ratio. So probably should have put that statement in, but you're absolutely right. Yeah.
We're up against the time block here, so speed.
Yeah. So exercise, very important for the main point is that most of glucose should go to the muscle and be stored as glycogen and hopefully used later for energy, fast bouts of energy. So exercise increases the receptors that we saw before in the diagram of the mechanism, the GLUT4 receptor, and improves the transport of glucose inside. So exercise has this therapeutic effect, and the more we increase this ability to take and store glucose, the better, the more like resistant we are to insulin resistance. Yeah, we can, the more we delay insulin resistance. There's an extra effect there in exercise that is, and this relates to this insulin vasodilator and vasomodulatory effects. There is vascular adaptation that happen with physical exercise, more blood flow, and more endothelial insulin sensitivity, which was not often accounted for. Another aspect that we shouldn't forget, I think it can be forgotten, is that lipids in the muscle cell have a huge role. So the ability of the muscle cell to oxidize those lipids and to store them efficiently is very important. So that's something else that exercise helps with, is the improving the mitochondrial oxidative capacity and yeah, the ability to move on those lipids, because sometimes the insulin resistance actually happens because of too much lipid, if not the problem of glucose and glycogen storage. So there are the two aspects of dealing with the lipids and dealing with the glycogen. Ideally, we would use the muscles in a way to improve both functionalities.
Mhm.
This ties in the different muscle types, have different fat storage. It's very interesting. Of course, the type of exercise we do would affect one or the other more or less, but yeah. So exercise.
Awesome.
Okay, this is me. So other causes, magnesium seems specifically involved in electrical activity and insulin secretion in pancreatic beta cells, epigenetics like androgens during pregnancy, microRNAs, androgen excess in general can impair insulin action and metabolic flexibility. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease and oxidative stress, we've seen this like reactive oxygen species come up a lot, and the fatty acid levels that Kaled was talking about earlier. The gut-derived endotoxins, there's been a lot also about these bacteroidetes and how people with obesity or insulin resistance might have more of these than other phyla. Thyroid disease and how you metabolize carbohydrates. And for menopause, estrogen can have a preventative effect against insulin resistance and glucose intolerance. This circadian misalignment idea where your cortisol levels might change your glucose homeostasis and insulin resistance. And then genetics, of course, there's like a lot of different genes that can influence weight gain and satiety and all of these things. And then there was an interesting fact about depression and the same genes involved in glucose metabolism and insulin resistance and cancer were also involved with depression, so they could have the same root cause.
Yeah, and this probably isn't an exhaustive list either. Any comments?
Sorry, I was muted. I like most of the list. I think some of these may be associations, not causations. For example, the gut stuff, bacteroiditis, I cannot pronounce it either. So the level of that may be very dependent on the diet and whether it's a cause or an effect. So maybe some kind of diets are higher in bacteroiditis, but may not mean that that causes anything related to insulin resistance. The diet can, but not the levels of the bacteria.
And so much of this is positive feedback loops. So it's hard to investigate insulin resistance and then assume would this be common in somebody on a ketogenic diet, when likely a ketogenic diet wouldn't have manifested in them being insulin resistant in the first place. So generally, we're assuming that a person who does fall into the gut-derived endotoxin category is somebody who is eating a diet that would result in insulin resistance in the first place as well. So
yes, but sometimes, for example, I don't know, high meat diet can be can happen when you eat hamburgers and or just being carnivore, and both can have similar effect on bacteroiditis. I'm not sure, but still one diet is causing insulin resistance and the other is not. And the other thing I wanted to mention, the androgen excess, it may be a reverse correlation. Maybe insulin resistance causes this androgen excess, because actually I read it in the document that you wrote that high insulin doesn't let testosterone to be converted to estrogen. So so that may be a reverse causation.
Jennifer?
For the endotoxins, when I did the deep dive on gut dysbiosis, one of the problems was that some organisms in the gut were creating these branched chain amino acids, and that their insufficient further breakdown causes like system-wide inflammation. So there's like all these other intertwining mechanisms. And for the androgen excess, I found like a lot of conflicting evidence on like androgen excess, insulin, and the relationship with PCOS too. So yeah, I'm still like understanding more about it.
Yeah,
it's a big question which causes which.
I am inclined to agree with Cheesy that seems like reverse causation, given what limited information I have. But either way, points that will likely be elucidated when we discuss other topics like PCOS. Okay. Oh, you're right.
It's me again.
What's the exhausted list?
Yeah. Endocrine disruptors, we all know about those. There's a bunch of them in the environment. Again, some of these, it's hard to know correlation versus causation. Oxidative stress and might be involved in a lot of these things too. So these nitrosamines that are found in cigarette smoke seem to have a larger effect, or in some of the models, than other things. BPA, which is like in plastics, of course, BPA, BPB, all of those things can actually, let me see, and even in a dose-dependent manner, I think, also had an effect. The phthalates, and the study looked at mixtures of different chemicals. So, because of course we're not just all introduced to one thing at a time. We have these mixtures in our bodies, so it might have positive joint effects. Persistent organic pollutants. Some of these were just on animal studies because you can't be testing these things on humans. But some of them had downregulation of insulin-induced gene 1, and then the polyfluoroalkyl chemicals, the forever chemicals, also. They might cause some cholesterol effects, but the jury wasn't really out. They don't bioaccumulate in the fats as other ones do, but if they're involved with the liver, it could cause downstream effects.
Cool.
Yeah, so this is the area where we could explore something that is not yet insulin resistant in the system, like we described before. But the beginning of it, which would show us a patient possibly with high insulin, but kind of normal glucose levels. It could start, actually, the toxin topic was good to have before this, because in the papers that I looked at, it's something with modern diet or toxin could affect the pancreas, causing extra, like dysfunction and dysregulation in the pancreas. Could be in the beta cells or in the communication between beta and alpha cells. But yeah, the new model based on this would be that before insulin resistance, we would have just high insulin, hyperinsulinemia, because of dysregulation. That would trigger insulin resistance in the various tissues with time, till a certain failure of the pancreas later on, which we call diabetes. So from normal, the green area, if we see like the scale with time down there, the new model starting with hyperinsulinemia would say like that we have excessive insulin that is followed by insulin resistance, and then the depletion of the insulin, like the failure of the pancreas later on towards the diabetes. So very interesting. Might be our catch for as I said, like an early stage insulin dysregulation scenario.
Yeah. No, I agree. They are different enough that they probably warrant inclusion in the network, but we can cross that later.
This is a lovely diagram summarizing the different hormones. I mean, time restricted, so I'd say like the new entry that has been most interesting was glucagon, because as well as a hyperinsulinemic or hyperinsulinemia first model, there is also a glucagon-centric model of diabetes that says that dysregulation of the glucagon secretion is the entry to this whole like glucose homeostasis disturbance, because glucagon is then constantly telling the liver to produce glucose, even if insulin is there, and the pancreas just tries to keep up with that by secreting insulin also, which to us means hyperinsulinemia. But even that cannot stop the glucose production in the liver. The intervention, like papers say that they administer insulin, they take off insulin, they see that just that glucagon is the boss in that case, if there is this disruption. So that was the most interesting newcomer in the hormonal balance. We see other things like leptin, somatostatin, which affects actually the pancreas. Cortisol was interesting, also like for stress and the circadian model, which says that if we don't sleep enough, we get higher cortisol, which then changes the glucose homeostasis. So there are many players in this circus, but yeah, as I said, glucagon has been very interesting and possibly something that we can study like hyperinsulinemia and add to the network, the hyperglucagonemia.
Circus is the right word for this, Kaled.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah, as everyone knows, I love diagrams. So ketogenic diet, I mean, it's talking by itself. We see many benefits from up that usually there is an increase of protein intake and absorption with beneficial thermic effects. So higher satiety. The ketone bodies have many different beneficial effects. Directly suppress appetite. I like especially the lowering of oxidative stress, which happens as a like adaptation. This was very interesting, the one that I looked a bit deeper into. Basically, at the beginning, the ketogenic diet might trigger some extra ROS production, but that's like the positive one that doesn't lead to apoptosis, just tell the cell to improve and create new tools to deal with the oxidation of ketones. We see the microbial alteration down there because a ketogenic diet obviously implies lower carbs. So all that toxicity from the gut and so on would change. And yeah, the obvious lower glucose levels and better control by the liver of the gluconeogenesis. So we would avoid by that the glucagon issues that we described before. Yeah, and hopefully lower insulin resistance and all the effects on the right with resolution of type 2 diabetes, lowering obesity, lowering non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and PCOS.
Yeah, it's I struggle with things that seem like 100% benefit with no detractors, but I do struggle to see how a ketogenic diet would not benefit somebody with
Yeah,
insulin
it's
resistance.
just an adaptation issue.
Yeah.
Need to push over the flu.
Okay.
Yeah, this would I looked after that into. So, okay, this is a bit complex, and here glucagon shows up again. Basically, they say that in obese people where insulin is high and glucagon is high. Okay, I have to remember this. I'm sorry. So there is an inhibition of ketolysis. Yeah. So in the case of fat tissue, and this is interesting, like there is insulin, it is still a bit stronger than glucagon when it comes to fat metabolization. So not glycogen, but the fat storages just won't be broken down if there is high insulin. But if a person has low insulin, like a diabetic person, and they might have still glucagon producing glucose. So we have this glucose in the blood. Let's take a diabetic person. Glucose in the blood, low insulin, high glucagon. We would see both breakdown of ketones, like of fatty acids, which raises ketone bodies, but at the same time, high glucose, and that's the ketoacidosis.
Mm-hmm.
An obese person, hyperinsulinemic person, so the early stages of hyperinsulinemia or prediabetes, in that case, the insulin actually manages to suppress ketone production. So we wouldn't see the ketoacidosis, but only high glucose in the blood. So that's an area in which, like, one has to understand the interplay between glucagon and insulin. But the extreme of it is the easy case to understand is diabetes and ketoacidosis. Because then insulin actually says, no, we don't break down. Insulin says, yeah, we store fat. Yeah, no, sorry. There is low insulin in diabetes, so ketone bodies are broken down. And the glucose stay high. So there is ketoacidosis.
Yeah, so the inhibitory effect of insulin on
glucagon.
ketosis.
Yeah.
This slide will likely benefit from a little bit of a reduction. So
yeah.
we can revisit this later.
Yeah.
Is this call it again?
No. If it's a diagram, it's probably me.
If
But
you're out of breath too, I can take this.
Yeah, you know more actually about this. I just found a good diagram and
Gotcha. So essentially, insulin resistance is a decision that's intentionally made by every cell in the body. as a protective mechanism against presumably a lot of different things, but reactive oxidant species or reactive species appear to be one of the dominant ones. So whether we're talking about beta oxidation or we're talking about the citric acid cycle, two competing energy substrates, but as a natural result and necessarily, reactive species are created as signaling molecules. The thing is that they can be incredibly detrimental to membrane potential and other organelle function in the cell if they get out of control. So generally, we are seeing that mitochondria are electing to downregulate their insulin sensitivity in an effort to reduce oxidative stress in the cell, when energy substrates are either being competed in that there's a lot of ketones and glucose in the blood, or if you're in a hyperglycemic environment. This essentially is just the theory that with chronic high levels of reactive stress in the cell, you could see things like premature apoptosis, you could see mitophagy, you could see a over-reliance on mitochondrial fusion, which is in some ways less ideal than mitochondrial fission. Essentially, this protective mechanism is evolutionary advantageous, but the fact that we never break out of it leads to systemic tissue-specific effects at the mitochondrial level. So obviously, we don't see insulin resistance manifesting the same way across different tissues. That could likely be a consequence of the mitochondrial density in these different tissues, because there could be thousands of mitochondria depending on what cell you're talking about. This threshold will be varied, but in general, the mitochondrial hypothesis that fits into insulin resistance is one that's reacting to oxidative stress in the cell and a body's self-preservation method from a hyperglycemic environment. Anything else there? Okay. That is it, essentially. So that was a lot of information. We do have a couple areas that I think need to be either qualified differently in a slide or maybe just elaborated on a little bit differently. But in general, when it comes to dietary, lifestyle, genetic, or other factors, I think every topic has been given consideration.